Morning, students. This is Roger Hanegraaff, and what I've got for you today is All right, hey, how are you doing this week? I hope well. And so what I wanted to do in this video is go over the homework from last week. Now, the homework from last week is an important one, so I want to step through it here and show you how you would complete it. You can compare it to what you turned in to get help. I also wanted to go over the content just a little bit as a review, and that way you can hopefully help prepare you for the test when that comes along in the upcoming weeks. All right, so here's your homework. We want to go over that, and what is the homework all about? It's about two things. One of those is something called an indifference curve. And I've gone over that in the notes, but just as a review, an indifference curve tells you or describes to you about you as a consumer how indifferent you are to buy one product over another. Now, one thing that we know about consumers is they don't just always buy one thing, they buy multiple things. And they do that to maintain a level of satisfaction. So an indifference curve is just a simple illustration. It's more complex. Of course, there's more than two things you want to buy. But it's a simple illustration that you will swap satisfaction between products. You're indifferent. You will trade them for satisfaction. When you go into a grocery store, if you're going to have a barbecue and you're going to buy hamburger and maybe some chicken to cook, if you go in the store and something makes you decide you want to buy more of one product over the other, that's an illustration of indifference curve. You will exchange those products for different things. Maybe it's the availability. Maybe it's the quality. It could also be the price, but you will trade products for each other to try to maintain some level of satisfaction. So an indifference curve is just an illustration, a simple illustration of two products. In the homework, we were looking at going to buy pork and fish, and we are combining those to have probably some kind of a cookout. So when we go in to buy those, we actually are trading them. We're going to buy a little more pork, a little more fish, and it depends on lots of variables. So that's called an indifference curve. Now, as a consumer, one thing that we always do is want more. We will buy more and more and more. And finally, when we get to some point, we have as much as we possibly would want. But what stops us from getting there is probably money. So that's the second part of the homework, and that's called a budget line. Now, it's just simply a linear relationship. It's I've got so much money. In the homework, you have $50 to spend. So when you go into the store, you can buy all of one or all of the other, but we're not going to do that because as an indifference curve, you actually combine those. You may buy a very little of one, you buy a lot of the other, but you combine. And so the idea is that we won't buy the extremes, but the budget line is just about the money. It doesn't care what we actually want. So when you take indifference curves, what we want, and you connect those with how much money we have, the budget, then you get to something called an equilibrium. And that is what is the important point on the whole thing, is about how much you actually would spend and want. And when those meet, that's called equilibrium. And that's the values that matter. So in the homework, I wanted to go over how that works. Also, the homework was delivered to you online, of course, so you could have printed it, you could have worked it by hand, and then you could have scanned it and submitted it back in. So those are kind of the normal practices. You might also learn to use your computer a little bit better. If you've got a tablet you can write on, that may even be easier. You can kind of do your writing on the digital copy. But anyway, those are the approaches, and I'm also going to share with you through this video of how I would complete it on a computer using Microsoft Word. So let's go into the homework and get a key for you to use. All right, so I'm going to go away here and let's look at your homework. Now your homework here, homework 1, you had some stuff given to you to kind of get you started. You had budget 1, and it was where you saw that you had $50 to spend, and the price of fish is $2.50 and the price of pork is $4.50. Now I like to build this table. It helps me communicate this and maybe even help you follow it. So the price of fish at $2.50, $50 divided by $2.50 means that if we bought all fish, we would therefore then buy 0 pork and 20 units of fish at $2.50. Now, when the price of pork moves to $4.50 with $50, you would have 11.11 of pork, but then that's all you would have, so you would have 0 fish, and so that was given. Now, I also gave you the indifference curve, which is combinations of the products. You would buy very little fish, mostly pork, or you could switch and buy very little pork and mostly fish. And those were illustrated along this indifference curve. Now, that's an indifference curve at a certain point. There's ones that are higher, that are out here, further away, and then there's ones that are lower. They're closer to the origin, way down here. And an indifference curve down here is going to be where you just don't have quite enough money, but you still want to buy those two products. Now, one thing you notice about a difference curve is they're not straight. They're typically curved. And that's because, and the notes talked about it, there is a marginal rate of substitution. When you go from 23 to 1, you jump way down with pork at 13 to 3. Then you drop down very little, 11 to 4. Then you drop down. And so you can see it changes not at consistent values. That dropped by 2, that increased by 4. That's called the marginal rate of substitution, meaning marginal means change. So you're changing the substitution between pork and fish, meaning they're not equally valuable. You swap them, and you swap them at different rates. So indifference curves illustrate to us that we vary the amounts of changes of products, and that's why the line is sloped. Now, budget is straight. If you're going to spend all your money on fish, you can buy 20. If you spend all your money on pork, you can buy 11.11. If you draw a straight line, that's going to be an equal swap of money because the prices are fixed. So it's just a straight line. So, but the key is equilibrium. So right here, where these two equal, tells you that you would buy about 9 pounds of fish. Well, if you buy 9 pounds of fish, there is a price of $2.50. So I did the math down there. 9 pounds of fish totals $22.50 in spending. So that means you've got $27.50 left. If you divide that by the price of pork, then that turns out to be 6.11 pounds, and you would spend the rest of that $27.50. And then you can see in the graph here, that actually kind of lines up with about what we would have. So that's going to be 6.11 pounds of pork, 9 pounds of fish. Those are the important results from this whole illustration, and that's equilibrium. All right, now I had you do it on your own. Let's go through what that looked like. So $50 spending, 2.5, that didn't change. So that's 0 fish. And that is 20 pounds, or 0 pork, 20 pounds of fish. Same that we had in the beginning. Now, this is what changed. The grocery store put pork on sale, so it was $4.50. Now it's $2. So that means that we can buy 25 pounds of that. That's 25 times 2 is 50. So 50 divided by 2 is 25. And then, of course, if we do that, if we spend all our money on pork and we have no more money left for fish. Now, that's just to get us a budget line. So how do we get the budget line drawn? Well, I've got a line over here drawn that I did in Microsoft Word here. You just basically go to draw, and or actually I go to insert shapes, and I pick these to draw these. So I'm going to go over here and just drag that over here, and let's see, for fish, that was 20. So I start my line right there, grab the other end, and go over here to pork, which is possible to buy 25. So I go kind of right between those two, and I'm going to put 25 is right there. All right, so now that is our new budget line, and I've got myself a new indifference curve pushed a lot further out than the other one. So that means we're buying more product, obviously. Now, there's a bunch of indifference curves, but I went ahead and drew them to help you. So what we're looking for is we're looking for equilibrium. In fact, we're looking for where do these line up. Now, your answers here might be a little bit different than mine because this line touches, really, I've got a dotted line I'm going to use here. This line touches here. It begins. So that's where our money and our satisfaction meet. Now, it also touches here. And so that's also true. So I kind of went in the middle and I just grabbed myself a quantity. Really, any variation along here would have worked. So you could have said maybe 12, 13, 14, 15, or 16. Somewhere in here would have landed your decision on pork. Now, once you pick that spot, though, you do have to come horizontally across and look at the decision on fish. Now, in looking at my graph here, I've got a pretty clear 14, so I'm going to come down here and write a little bit of results here. So it looks like that we are going to select at equilibrium 14 pounds of pork. So before, just to make a note, we definitely went up because we only bought the 6.11 pounds of pork before, but that's because we had a whole different price situation. So when prices drop, people tend to buy more, but they also have that other product to buy. So it's not a one-to-one move. In fact, in this case, 6.11 went to 14. And so if you look at the price change, the price went from $4.50 to $2. It dropped by more than half. But yet we didn't double how much. We actually went even over that. So we went all the way from 6.11 to 14. All right, so that's the move. I've got 14. You could have picked, again, any of those numbers along here, but I went right in the middle of the touch point, which gave me a better equilibrium. All right, so that was what I chose, was 14. So if we select 14 pounds of pork, and we're looking at the price of pork being, in this case, $2, that equals to spending $28 in expense, right? So that's how much we have that we're spending right now. So that means that we have remaining, if we look at $50 minus the 28, we have $22 remaining. And if we divide that by our amount we have for fish, that is $2.50. So that means that, I have to grab my calculator here to make sure I get this right. If we have $22 in spending, I have $22, left over to spend, divided by 2.5, and that is going to be 8.8 pounds of, what do we have left to buy? Fish. And so if I look at this right here, 14 is my illustration. That works. If I run my line across there, it's a little bit more than 9, or a little bit less than 9. Sorry, it's 8.8. So that actually matches my graph. So when you do your math here, you want to kind of check yourself to the visual results to make sure that you're in good shape. All right, so that looks like a pretty good result here. If I go to the next page, it asked me to develop a demand curve showing the two prices. And specifically, we're looking at the $4.50, and it went to $2 because we're talking about just pork. Now, the thing to understand about a demand curve is it always represents one product. So budget lines and indifference curves represent two products. Demand curves typically represent one. And that's what we're looking at in this case. What is our decision on pork? All right, so we move down here. I've got an illustration here. I've got the demand curve already drawn. Again, just like some of the notes you've seen, I've got a y-axis here that represents the prices, and I've already put them in here. Those prices were $4.50 and $2 for pork. I've also got an x-axis here that represents quantity, and I went ahead and put in the quantities, 6.11, which is the first equilibrium, and 14. Now I want to pause here for a second. Here's the mistake. Whenever I ask you what are the results on demand, and so here is a summary that you need to make sure you're aware of. So if the price of pork, if I can spell pork, if the price of pork is, it started out at $4.50. If the price of pork is $4.50, then we will buy, and that's where I want to go back and look. Be careful here. When the price of pork was $4.50, that's this whole first budget. Sometimes the mistake is 11.11. Don't forget, that is nothing more than the budget. Equilibrium is what's important, and you want to make sure these quantities balance each other, and we did. The answer was 6.11. That's why I have 6.11 down there in the graph, and that's why we buy 6.11. The next is when the price changed to $2, right? Then we buy, and that is, again, we come back up, look at the equilibriums. It is not 25. That was the budget, not the equilibrium. Equilibrium landed on 14. So we come down here, we buy 14. So then I just have to graph the results. So when the price was $4.50, really high, we bought 6.11. So that is $4.50. That is 6.11. That is the point. The next point is when the price dropped down to $2, we bought more, which I'm going to plot right there at 14. And then you're just basically going to connect these with a line that I've already got here. And the result is that this is demand. Demand is listed in the graph where our prices and our equilibrium quantities are balanced with price and quantity, and that is the demand curve. Now notice the demand curve is downward sloping. This demand curve could have been sloped lots of different ways if you had different results. So I'm going to kind of try to, let's see here, put this back where it was. This is your demand curve line right here that we've talked about through these points. This is the shape of the demand curve. It's always negatively sloping because when you drop the price, you always increase the quantity. But the demand curve could be sloped straight up and down, which would be a different relationship between those two variables. Or the demand curve could be very flat. Also, different relationships between the price and the quantity. Now, our demand curve was somewhat like this based on the price and quantity change. And so that is the demand curve. How this demand curve is shaped is something we'll talk about next. But mainly in this homework, we want to make sure that you understand that demand is the result of budgets and indifference curves on what people want to be satisfied, which is what this exercise was all about. How do you balance money and what people want? You want to make sure that it's always not just about the money. The budget is important, but it's when budget and satisfaction meet that we get something called equilibrium, and that is the focus of what builds demand. Okay, hopefully this helps to go over the content a little bit, show you some common mistakes. In other words, the budgets are important, but they don't relate to equilibrium. That's something different. So you want to make sure you really know the difference between those two. And when you talk about demand, it's about the equilibriums. It's not about just the money anymore. And that's the result of demand. The other thing important on this is the demand is always talking about one product. You might demand lots of products, and that's more of an indifference curve budget line conversation. But when we talk about a specific demand, we're usually talking about the one product, and that's what this example was. All right, hope this helps. Make sure you take these notes that I've illustrated here for you and compare that to the homework and how you did it. Correct your work, and that way you'll be better prepared for the test. Thanks.